Alex Smith was the ex-CEO of the Cares family, and under his leadership, this organization brought together over 30,000 people to try and reduce loneliness and fight intergenerational polarization. Through this role, Alex shaped the world's first ever government-level loneliness strategy, which was launched by the former UK Prime Minister at a Cares family event. Alex is now a senior development advisor for Europe at the Obama Foundation. Today, Alex is speaking to us in a personal capacity. So Alex, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I am excited to talk because last time we had you on here, we spoke at length about loneliness, about belonging, all the different sort of things pulling young people in different directions and all people for that matter. Of course, a lot is made about why we saw the riots in Southport. One of the major reasons people say is because young people are more susceptible to these online groups because they're lonely, right? And loneliness has become this really big topic. I recently saw even announced that the UK government are doing a report into loneliness, or they're looking into loneliness, looking to hire someone to think about that. You've been working in this field for a while, so I thought we would start with just getting our terms straight. So, what is loneliness?
It's a great question. Thank you for having me, firstly. It's a pleasure to see you again. To my mind, I've got a kind of multifaceted analysis of loneliness, and I think of it in different ways. Firstly, I think there's a technical definition. And in the field of loneliness that you mentioned, the technical definition of loneliness is the gap between the quality and quantity of relationships that people have versus the quality and quantity of relationships that people need or want. So there's a technical definition there. I think secondly, it's important to say that loneliness, in its most basic sense, is also a human emotion, right? It's like happiness or sadness or joy or excitement. And the human feeling, the emotional feeling of loneliness is, for anyone who's experienced it, I think it's akin to a yearning or a loss, or even a kind of sense of wondering who I am and my role in the world. And to an extent even, it's similar to the feeling of homesickness, I think, and I'll come back to why I think that's important. So there's a technical definition, there's kind of an emotional definition. In my mind, we've got to think about what are the causes of loneliness, because loneliness is, depending on different studies, either on the rise or on the rise in certain demographics, or at least felt much more chronically than it has been in the past. And I think of the reasons for why that is. Firstly, economics. So globalization has contributed to it, changing communities that result from globalization. Immigration, I think, is part of that picture. Digitization, hyper-capitalism, right? This kind of sense that you can do everything on a machine, but we are losing the sense of connection to one another, or you can contact people all around the world at the drop of a button, but people are feeling less deeply connected to those people that they're in relationship with. So there's a kind of economic lens on this. There's a cultural lens. We are less involved statistically in associations like membership organizations, trade unions, faith groups. We participate less in those congregational spaces. We are, not so often participating in trade unions, for example. So there's cultural reasons we're living alone more, or single occupancy living is on the rise. I also think then there's political reasons for why loneliness is being felt much more now than perhaps in the past. The decimation of youth clubs, for example, austerity, inequality, people feeling like they don't necessarily belong in a community anymore. And then I think there's a class issue at stake as well. So in particular, I think while loneliness is an everybody issue and everybody can experience it, it's also an equity issue. So the people who are marginalized more from economies and cultures and society in general experience loneliness more as well, in general, statistically. And that might be migrants or refugees, or it could be LGBT plus people, or it could be low-income people who feel less connected to the changing people and places around them. So there's lots of kind of reasons why loneliness feels perhaps more intense now for those who experience it than in the past. I think then the final thing I'll say on this question is that you've got to think of the consequences of loneliness and what that's doing. I think this is relevant to our conversation today. And there are personal consequences for loneliness. It's a personal crisis. That feeling of yearning, that sense of who am I in this world, that's that kind of tragic sense of loss, a loss of belonging, a loss of identity. So it's a personal crisis. It's also a public health crisis, because loneliness has been shown to be as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It leads to strokes, it leads to heart attacks, it leads to depression, it leads to dementia. Some studies have even shown that it can be it's a causal factor in cancer as well. So, it's a public health crisis. 1 in 10 GP appointments is taken up by somebody with no other condition than that they're lonely. So people are going to the doctors to have a conversation with somebody, which obviously has massive consequences for the National Health Service. But I also think it's a political issue, and maybe we can dive into some of these areas. And I think it's a political issue because loneliness and withdrawal from society and your relationships, for whatever reason of, kind of trauma or the lack of identity or the lack of belonging, loneliness can lead to discriminating other people, stereotyping other people, othering people who are not like you. Loneliness is shown in some studies to be one of the factors in young people in particular, increasingly turning away from a trust in democratic institutions and democratic cultures, democratic norms, and democracy in general. So there's a lot to unpick there for us in this conversation, but at the basic level, yes, it's a human emotion, but I think there are reasons why people are experiencing it, especially importantly now, and those are economic, they're cultural, they're social. So yeah, lots for us to
Yeah. Thank you. That was really helpful, because I think clarifying terms is really important. What we mean by loneliness, I think will help us have this conversation better, because I guess the aim of this conversation and conversations like this is, how do we build up a community's resilience, if you like, to hateful extremism, to hate. And whilst you were saying that, my mind sort of went to, again, those pictures of those riots that happened in Southport. And of course, we saw riots in other parts of the country as well. And someone may say, watching this, they might say, well, hold on, you're talking about loneliness, but those young and old people who were throwing bricks at mosques, that were sort of, taking part in vandalizing private property, they seemed pretty together. They seemed like they had community. So is there something about this sort of loneliness that young people feel, or that people feel in general, that makes them more likely to look for community in these sort of, albeit very sort of thinly defined sense of community, in these sort of hate groups or groups that, come together to sort of attack other people?
That is a complex question. And I want to do kind of service and honor to the tragedy that you mentioned in the first instance around Southport. It was obviously an awful and horrible event. And I think that there is in no way any excuse or even justification for the reaction of people to lead with hate, as you say, and division, rather than to lead in those circumstances with a sense of empathy for other people who have experienced such an awful loss and tragedy. All of that said, underlying the reaction that we saw in the summer at the end of July and the beginning of August, where it wasn't just in that local community that people lashed out, but it was really all across the country ultimately. You have to ask the question, what's going on here, right? And so some of what I've already explained about the economics of it, people who are already marginalized or feeling left behind by globalization or by politics, or not feeling part of a community and that they belong, that is, I think, undeniably part of the question, part of the picture, sorry. But, there are also other kind of manipulations occurring here. So, yes, people who are already isolated or lonely or feeling left out from the bigger picture are cultivated by people with nihilistic intentions who want to mobilize those people who are feeling left out from society for other ends, whether those are political ends or cultural ends. I do think that in this country we have long had an issue, and I mentioned class, which has been, accentuated and perpetuated by the economic crash and people feeling left out of society or their own community, people feeling like they're not seen, they're not heard. And, there is the classic phrase about rioting that it is the last resort of the unheard. I think in this scenario, this summer with the riots that we had, there was something else going on, right? And I think this is a kind of established truth now about some of what happened in the summer, which is that those people who were manipulating and organizing for a specific political goal were doing so using social media, using disinformation and misinformation, using technologies that are kind of under-regulated and under-monitored, and doing so in a way that was intentionally galvanizing people to react in a way that would stir something up in the country, right? And whether that's because of the prejudice, the discrimination, the othering that I was already talking about, all of those are factors. But even underlying all of that, again, we live in an individualistic society where people who are feeling left out of cultures and economies have often historically, if you look at football hooliganism, for example, have sought to find their tribe, right, and their place that they can belong, and some sense of entitlement and an expression of kind of anger and lashing out at the world around them for really no other reason. And I'm sure there were political motivations for some of the people who were part of those riots. But my guess would be that a majority were there to cause trouble and have fun. And, I think drugs and alcohol were clearly part of the picture there. And people get swept up in the kind of mob mentality. So I think it's a really complex issue. It's a really complex question. But I do think in this country, and actually in kind of deindustrializing countries around the world, because I think this is an issue in other countries across Europe and obviously in America too, there are demographics of people, and there's a particular question about men who have not yet found an identity in a globalized world, have not yet found new relationships that are positive and healthy for them in a globalized world. And that's something that governments around the world, civil society organizations, businesses and individuals, I think all need to be aware of, all need to feel their stake in, and all need to be trying to do something about.
Yeah. I mean, I do wonder when you talk about men, in recent years, we've seen the rise of lots of sort of strong men-like figures, most notably on social media, postulating, maybe suggesting what genuine manhood is. All these different ideas of masculinity are sort of being bandied around. And it's something I've often thought about, what's happening with men, what happened, when did the flip switch such that now, it's open season on what it means to be a man, and the sort of these figures that that sort of model bravado, and we can't talk about the riots, of course, without talking about Andrew Tate and the part he played and other people have played in retweeting and sharing the misinformation and the disinformation you speak about. I mean, when you think about loneliness and you think about men, what is happening?
So I think lots of things are happening all at once, and I think many things have happened slowly over the last 40 years. And in the last podcast we did, which maybe we can put a link to in the bottom of this on YouTube, we talked a lot in that conversation about 40 years of change, so 40 years of globalization, 40 years of hyper-capitalism that have left people feeling marginalized and left out. But I think in that scenario, something also happened very quickly. So it was slow, things have been building for a long time, but then things have been fast as well. And I've already mentioned the 2008 economic crash. If you look at various statistics on growth and NHS waiting lists and the rise of technology and income inequality, there is a clear change after 2008 and over the last 15 years or so. And so, some of what's going on with men, I think, and Richard Reeves in the United States, who used to work for Nick Clegg in Number 10 in the UK, he speaks very eloquently about this, and everyone should go out and read his book of Boys and Men, because it's a very powerful case for why we need to ask these questions about what's going on with men. And of course, it's not all men, but we have a male problem, I think, in Western societies. Some of those things that are going on include a flatlining of income for men. Growing sectors in the economy are sectors that, in general, women are performing better in and men are performing less well in. We have not had enough vocational training, whether in schools or colleges. There's been an underinvestment in that. If you look at simple things like life expectancy, right? Many men are living disproportionately short lives compared to women, and that's not necessarily going in the right direction. If you look at mental health and people who are affected by extreme mental health outcomes, all the way up to people taking their own lives, it's a vast majority of the number of people who are taking their own lives, a vast majority are men. That's disproportionately a male issue. And then, kind of depression, addiction, alcoholism, these are all issues that are affecting men, largely more than they're affecting women. And I think the point that Richard Reeves makes about equality is really important, that this is not a zero-sum game, right? Governments, businesses, individuals, in looking at issues that men have that are going on, whether in the education system, higher education, schools, mental health, etc., we can pay attention to those issues. We can have government policies on those issues. We can have a different story about the role of men in society, while also not taking our eye off the ball on gender equality when it comes to women, because in the economy, obviously on equal pay and various other things, it's women who are suffering the brunt of unfairness. So I think there are so many things going on, and it's dangerous sometimes to generalize, but those statistics on men in the economy, men's sense of identity, men's sense of belonging, men's sense of their role in the world, in this country at least, we don't have a very good answer as to why men are feeling the way that they're feeling.
But I'm so glad you brought up those health outcomes, right? And all the different sort of realities where you see this disproportionate effect, because, of course, one of the things that can happen when, whether it's the Manchester bombings or it's the riots, is we go, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? Whereas the larger question is, how do we address all the underlying issues that are sort of ripping and tearing societies apart, local communities apart at the seams? Because again, as you were speaking, my mind was going to the fact that there was a time where people found community mainly in place where they lived and who lived sort of in proximity to them. And increasingly, people are more concerned. I mean, people in Manchester, in Levenshulme, or in Longsight are more concerned about what's happening with Donald Trump or what's happening with Vladimir Putin. And sort of these larger, big ideas have become what dominates people's sort of thought life. I've always wondered why that's the case. I mean, to your point, we become more globalized, we become more interconnected. But I do wonder why it is that place doesn't carry the same sort of cachet it used to do when people think about identity.
Well, we have long canonized celebrity, heroes, whether in Hollywood or music or politics, and one of the things that I think is a thread in my career is this sense of localism, and actually there are positive role models in most communities, and those role models are close to, and people can have relationships with those role models, and we need to get to a place, this is not a nostalgic thing, we need to get to a place that's future facing in order to meet the challenges that we need to meet in the coming generations, where we can be open to big ideas and kind of globalized media, while also feeling rooted in place, and that we know our neighbors, and that we feel a sense of belonging to not just the place that we live in, but also the other people who are around us. So I think that's really important. In my work that I did for 12 years with the Cares family, bringing older and younger people together in specific local places in order to build community and build belonging and intergenerational connection and love fundamentally between different generations. I often used to think that the places that we worked in were not just backdrops to people's lives, but they were characters in them. And actually, when those places are transforming, often it feels like they're transforming faster than ever before, then people feel this kind of sense of being unanchored, or that they don't have a community space to go to, or that people are so busy, everyone's got their faces in their phones the whole time. Of course, that's part of the picture. I'm always shocked by the statistic that it takes, most people on average will receive around 3,000 messages, whether that's a notification on social media, an email, a text message, before they receive or have one meaningful interaction with a loved one. 3,000 versus one, right? The balance is wrong. And I think we are exposed to strong men, icons and cultures from around the world. And actually, if we look within our own communities, we will see that there are men and women who are wonderful role models who are active in their communities, who are working incredibly hard, who are participatory in some of those kind of associations and faith groups and membership organizations, albeit that those are diminishing to an extent. And people are just trying to do their best in that scenario, but feeling their power and their agency in the world slipping away from them because it's harder to get a doctor's appointment, childcare so expensive, costs of food and the cost of living in general have increased, but salaries haven't kept up with that. So people are kind of feeling powerless in general. And I think it helps, actually. One of the solutions in this is to look to your own kitchen table, to look at what can I do in my community, in my family, to not just feel a sense of belonging for myself, but also knowing that if I'm feeling belonging because I'm in relationship with others, then other people around me will feel that sense of connection too.
And you saw that cruel irony, actually, when people who were angry about how their country's changing then took to their local community to destroy it, to make the point. I mean, you'd think if you love your country, as it were, and you love your community and you're scared of the change that's happening, you didn't take a break and throw it at the sort of local shop where the person who serves you, your local butchers, where he works. I mean, these are people who live in the community. But again, it seems as though there is that cognitive dissonance between the points that people are making online, on Twitter, on Telegram, all these different social forums, and the sort of where they live and not knowing what's at stake. I kind of wonder what some of your thoughts are on how, particularly men, but also more broadly, how can we start to address some of these sort of loneliness points you're making, this lack of belonging that people seem to find in place? What are some of the things we can do?
So I think your point about patriotism and love of country is really important. To my mind, there is nothing patriotic, as you say, about smashing things up or singing bigoted songs or attending a football match with the purpose of having a fight, right? That is not a culture that I understand. Although I do think it's important to recognize why some people might want to behave that way and try to understand with compassion why people are in some instances doing things that are harmful to them. The people in the riots, many of them ended up in jail and with convictions that will now harm them for the rest of their lives. But there's nothing patriotic about those behaviors to my mind, and I consider myself a patriot. Patriotism is about what can you do in your community? How can you help other people to feel a sense of belonging, whether they've been there for 80 or 90 years, as some of the older people we worked with in the Cares family had been in one community their whole lives, or whether it's people arriving from all over the world. And I think the type of patriotism that I most believe in this country, in the UK, and this comes to your question about solutions, is one that is a big story about the kind of long arc of change and the long arc of time of British history, with all of the idiosyncrasies and all of the negative consequences of things that we may have done and did do around the world, plus taking some pride and celebrating sometimes on the things that we've been good at, the invention of the internet, the invention of the beautiful game, football, right? That's something that gives people a lot of community as well as being a place of harm for some people. But also that celebrates that this is an island. It's always been a trading post, a meeting place for people to the east of us in Europe and way beyond, people to the west of us in the United States, and that if you think about it, some of our greatest national heroes and national icons have not necessarily or their families have not necessarily been born and raised in this country. If you look at John Lennon, there's Irish heritage. You look at Winston Churchill, there's American heritage, right? So I think that we need to kind of create a bigger story, and that takes leadership. And the fundamental thing that I'm working on now and have been thinking about for a long time is leadership. And how do we get leaders that tell a bigger story, that invest in the idea of empathy and belonging, not as a zero-sum game, where if you belong, then I necessarily don't, right? Because that way leads problems. But so, leaders who are able to tell a bigger story about what we can do and be together. But then at a more kind of practical short-term level, on the men issue, my goodness, there are so many things can be done, right? From a bigger focus on equal parental leave, to better vocational training, to more mental health in workplaces, to campaigns that reduce the stigma of mental health for men all around the world. There's an organization called CALM, Campaign Against Living Miserably, that does that beautifully. To like addressing educational inequalities, whether that's teenage boys who are not doing as well often as teenage girls, or in university and access to university, that's all part of it. And even all the way back to early years, I think one of the things that Richard Reeves says in his work on boys and men in the US is this idea that actually boys should perhaps be going to school a year later than girls, at 6 instead of at 5, because that gives them more time to develop emotionally, more time to feel a sense of belonging before they're kind of put through that conveyor belt of rigor that they're not necessarily ready for age 5. So I think that there are lots of things that we can do to address economic inequalities in jobs, mental health, etc. But ultimately, we've got to kind of create this bigger story of who are we in this country in the 21st century, and how do we all participate in making this a better place where more people can belong?
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, and a key part of what you said is this patriotism point, and I do find it odd. It might be the Britishness and the stiff upper lip thing, but I do wonder why it is that we haven't had that same national reckoning with identity that a lot of countries, say South Africa post-apartheid, have done. And the US seems to always be having when it comes to the slave trade and how it treated indigenous people there. Because one of the things I really want to interrogate is this idea of patriotism. Who's British? Who gets to decide who's British? Because I was watching a news show, I won't say what channel, and there was a certain woman on the show who was talking about the new Labour leader, Kemi Badenoch, and I only bring it up because to make the point. Sorry, the new Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch. Sorry, thanks for correcting me. The horror on some Labour supporters' face right now. But this isn't a party political message, because this lady, who's also a Conservative, said that she likes Kemi Badenoch. However, she doesn't feel like Kemi Badenoch is very British. She doesn't feel like she embodies Britishness. And the person sat next to her said, well, why? And she said, well, she lived in Nigeria most of her life. She was in Nigeria for 15 years, and she came back now, and sure, she's been here for, more years, but she spent 15 years of formative years in Nigeria. And the man opposite said, well, she was born in this country though. And the lady goes, well, yeah, but being born here, that doesn't really mean much. She hasn't lived here, right? And then the man said, but Boris Johnson, the kind of quintessential British man, was born in America, in New York. And she was like, well, yeah, I know, but and as this man who sat next to her, who's also Conservative. And by the way, I was born in the USA as well. So if you're gonna do it on where someone's born, then some of the people you herald as the most British of all British weren't born here. And then if someone still lives here for 20 years out of sort of their 40-year life, still that's not enough. So what are you really trying to say here? And I think what was happening there is there's probably somebody who's got these ideas that they've never really aired out to somebody. And in that moment, the person sat next to her was able to interrogate and help her realize the sheer ridiculousness of her point.
And did she? Was she able to listen?
I think she sort of stuttered and her way out of it, and the interviewer in this case moved the conversation on. But it stayed with me for so long. Weeks after, I would be driving, I would be thinking of that experience of like, who gets to decide what's British, right? And who's the sort of identities are that gets to go, you can be British, you can't be British. And I suppose because this conversation hasn't been had in the public forum, we don't regularly in the UK have this conversation. So we've allowed certain groups, fringe groups at that, to define Britishness as this sort of thin experience that if you probe doesn't really make sense, right? Because it's about nationality, some folks know it's about birth, then it's about how long you've lived here. And then each time when they don't like somebody, they just change the criteria. What are your thoughts on, again, patriotism, but also this idea of identity and what, I guess, we can do better as a country to really maybe even define Britishness, because for a lot of people, it's still not very well defined.
It's not clear. People don't feel a sense necessarily British, or at least not all people do. There's not a sense of common direction. And I think, again, it comes back to that point of leadership. And actually, I think the pandemic is part of this picture. I can't believe that we never had a moment to reflect together some sort of kind of festival to celebrate what we came through, but also to recognize and acknowledge the huge loss, whether that's the loss of loved ones that people all around the country had, or the loss in our own lives, right? We're just not very good, and it's not very British to be emotional about things, right? Or to be overly analytical about things. And I think that given all of these challenges in this time of challenge and change, that actually is a real problem for us that we have to look at. And I think that there was a period about 15 years ago, towards the end of the Gordon Brown government and at the beginning of the first Conservative government, the Cameron Osborne government, where there was a big conversation about British values. What are British values? And this was post-crash, right?
So the big society.
Big society was part of it. That was a kind of Cameron philosophy, and I think a lot of people believe that there was a lot of truth and meaning in that, and a lot of people believe that it was a slogan for cover for other political projects. But it wasn't just Cameron, it was Brown doing this stuff as well, right? What are British values? I think Gordon Brown from Number 10 did it in a classically Brownite way. It was a bit top down. It wasn't emotional enough. It felt a bit clunky. David Cameron was probably a bit better at having some of these conversations. And by the way, he apologised for what happened in Northern Ireland with regard to Bloody Sunday. He apologised for the role of the police and the state in and after the Hillsborough disaster. He was doing some things which may have been kind of words rather than policies or big changes, but that I think were heading us in the right direction when it comes to that reckoning that you're talking about of relatively recent history, things that have happened that we still need to address. And I would now include the pandemic in that. And it strikes me now, I'm searching for primary schools for my little kids. And so I'm, kind of going into primary schools and having a look around and thinking, what is it that makes this place a place of community? Because many primary schools really are, both inside the classroom and outside the school gate for the parents who are part of that community. And the British values that were established and defined by David Cameron in that first 2010 to 2015 government are emblazoned on the walls of all of these primary schools.
Really?
Yeah, like every primary school I've been into has, I think it's these 5 British values that include like respect for the rule of law and freedom of speech and tolerance and acceptance, and it's kind of stuff that I think was heading in a reasonable direction, but is actually quite reductive when you just see a couple of words on a primary school, but at least the effort was there. Fundamentally, politically, I think this is important. We need a whole new period of like democratic renewal. We need to look at the House of Lords. We need to look at honesty in leadership and in politics. We need to look deeply at inequality. I think that's a fundamental thing that's going on here. Until we have that reckoning on so many of the issues and problems that we have right now, people are gonna feel that they're living disparate and individualized lives, right? And that's especially the case given the loneliness, the social isolation, the technology. And by the way, in the next 20 or 30 years, this is gonna get potentially even more complex because we're gonna have, we already have conflicts around the world, obviously in the Middle East and parts of Africa and other places around the world and on this continent for the first time in a generation. And that's going to lead to more people crossing borders. Obviously, economic inequality is going to lead to more people crossing borders. Climate change is going to lead to more people crossing borders. We already live in a globalized society where these challenges and opportunities are not properly being grappled with. And then if you factor in the arrival of artificial intelligence and how that's going to change how we interact, or so many jobs that we have, many of those manual jobs are going to be computerized or taken by robots, etc. So there's a perfect storm coming when it comes to some of these questions. And what I'm really focused on is how do we renew democratic cultures? How do we renew democratic institutions so that they're fit for the purpose for the future? That is about loneliness. It's about belonging. It's about community. It's also about a sense that in a globalized world, as I just said, you can be both open-minded to other people from around the world, but also feel a sense of rootedness and connection where you are.
And, to your point, it feels like all this pressure's bubbling up. And I think one of the ways to sort of release the pressure valve, if you like, is to have these conversations openly. As a black man, I think my relationship with Britishness is even more complicated in that, I find people of color, but also everyone really, but I can speak from my experience, I think often because we don't have mature conversations about this patriotism point, and the reason why it's so important is because for a lot of people, because of the lack of a healthy channel to sort of channel, if you like, for want of a better term, their patriotism is why it materializes in all these different other, say, more dangerous forms. Because it seems as though people have two reactions when we talk about Britishness. One is they feel disdain, it's ugly, it's not, historic wrongdoings that we haven't quite sort of settled. And so there is a great number of people, if you ask them, do you feel British? They would say no. They would never fly a flag outside their door. That flag is emblematic of all sorts of problematic things. And then you have another group who love being British, but their Britishness is this sort of exclusionary, thinly defined form of sort of Britishness that really is about excluding other people. And what we haven't done so far is sort of had this conversation about, well, yes, there was historic wrongdoings, but we also gave the world the steam engine, the World Wide Web, the chocolate bar, there's so much, the sandwich. There's so much we gave the world. And I think, I was actually thinking about it the other day, for such a small island, what this country has contributed to the world is massive. Right? It's massive. It's outsized. It's disproportionate.
You haven't even mentioned the music.
Oh my gosh, the computer. Like, there's just so much, But at the same, that's on one hand. But on the other hand, there are historic wrongdoings. There are, bad practices, and that's okay to say that we did some good, but we also did a lot of bad. And so let's have a mature conversation about what the future looks like. And I just wonder. Again, at risk, I do not want to get political at all, but I just wonder if only we had like leaders, local, community leaders and national leaders who would do better, to your point, to articulate the future. Here's what Britain can be in the future. Here's how in the future with AI and whatever, we can have I wonder if that would be mobilizing again for people all across, Dundee to all the way down to sort of Lewisham, who now may feel connected and feel like they can channel that patriotism, where right now it doesn't feel like you can channel it. Hence why these hate groups, for want of a better term, are really galvanizing young people and scooping them up and saying, come and channel it here.
I mean, it's a great point. And I think, though, that political leaders, given the traumas that many people have experienced, some of which you very eloquently articulated, are still very real for people. Political leaders need to earn and then re-earn and then re-earn the right and the space to tell that bigger story. So in the short term, the job of government, I think, in this country and in many other places around the world that are dealing with some of these same issues of rising authoritarianism and populism and the forces that we're talking about, the first job is to make people's lives a little bit better. Because if you look at history, when these forces are strong that we're discussing, it's when people feel insecure, economically insecure, socially insecure, culturally insecure. But the main thing really is economics. And when people are feeling economically secure and confident about the future, and that the lives of their children will be better than their own lives and the lives of their parents, and that the country is heading in the right direction, then we're in a better spot, right? So yes, a bigger story, a better story is very, very important. But I think in the short term, we've got to make it easier for people to have a GP appointment, because if people can't get a GP appointment, they're going to look for a reason why and a scapegoat as to why they can't get a GP appointment. And of course, the easy and the lazy option is to blame, well, there's too many people here now and the NHS is not fit for purpose. Or if they can't get cheap childcare, they're going to think, why? Well, the system's overwhelmed and there's not enough teachers, people don't want to do those jobs. And, so I think the first thing that government needs to do is just make sure that they are focused with such discipline on making sure that people just feel that the money in their back pocket and their ease of getting an appointment is 5% better than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. Then we get to a place when we're in a slightly more comfortable and secure position where we can grapple with some of these bigger picture issues, because I think this has been demonstrated in elections around the world. If voters and people in democracies feel, number one, that their government is self-serving and not doing enough for them, then they'll vote them out. Number two, that if politicians and leaders are talking about things that may be important within those little bubbles of the political party, but not talking about things that matter to people in communities every day, which is always the economy first in some way, or kind of livability, livelihoods. Unless you have a message on those things, you will never have the chance to have a message on the bigger, more complex things.
Shifting gears a bit, I wonder, if you could speak to somebody who, is maybe battling this sort of loneliness right now. We have a lot of people living in flats, they're living in sort of rented accommodation, and we spoke about it the last time you came. They don't know their neighbors, they're subscribed to all sorts of different things, and they've got, devices that make it easy to connect to a bunch of people, but even still they aren't feeling very connected. And I guess, oftentimes those people are vulnerable and susceptible, as we've spoken about before. I mean, what would you say to somebody who's sort of in that position?
As with so many personal crises, and I described it as a personal crisis as well as public health and a political crisis, the first thing one has to do is recognize that they have a problem. And I think there's been such a stigma around loneliness because it suggests or has implied in the past that people aren't very good at relationships, that they're not reliable, that they've got an issue, that they've got a problem. And actually, we're way beyond that right now. So what I would recommend people do, the one that I think I probably said in the last podcast, is be conscious of getting their 5 a day. 5 connections, whether that's in their community, calling a loved one. It can feel awkward at first. And again, this comes to the heart of Britishness, right? The stiff upper lip, it feels anathema to so many of us that we might pick up the phone and call that friend that you haven't spoken to for 3 months or 3 years or 30 years. But I think people want to be seen in this world of challenge and change where people are feeling insecure. So get your 5 a day. And it doesn't just have to be that meaningful conversation. It can also be, I think I said this last time, wave to your barber who cuts your hair once every few weeks as you go past. That doesn't just help you feel seen, it helps them feel seen as well. It brightens up their day. Speak to somebody at the checkout. Don't always default to the self-service checkout. Oh, no. Go and speak to somebody, do the hard thing, do the un-British thing. Go there and say, how you doing? Be playful, be cheeky, be flirtatious if that's what's necessary, right? Obviously, respect people and make sure that you're doing it in a polite way. Maybe that's very British as well. But go out of your way to make sure that other people are being seen. There was a moment in the pandemic, and I think ultimately we forgot this moment, but the first couple of months, it's not just about clapping NHS workers, right? That was beautiful and it was part of it, but it became a bit forced, I think, after a while. But there was a moment where I think our national narrative, the commentariat, the media, and most people in communities felt a new sense of value in people who do very difficult jobs and often unseen, low-paid jobs. So the people who are collecting the rubbish, the people who are stacking shelves, nurses, obviously, and doctors, right? Teachers, people that are the glue in a society that make things tick. And for a while, we remembered how important those people were. But then we kind of just went straight back to how it was after the pandemic, which is why I think having this moment would have been so important. So get your 5 a day. That's the most important thing that you can do.
I mean, I remember even during that period you're speaking about, I've never paid more attention to local media, because you were getting updates about what part of your. So I was living in Manchester at the time, and I remember just sort of hearing about places I'd never visited before. They would be like, this is happening here, or there's been an outbreak here, or this person did it, and you kind of go, wow, you really saw localism at its finest. I wasn't worried about what happened in Canada. I wasn't thinking about what's happening in America, even for that matter. I was focused really on my zone, my area, especially when they were, you remember when they were sort of moving different areas to different zones. So it'd be like, now this area is now in tier 3, and you're like, oh, we can go out, 2 runs a day rather than 1 run a day. And whilst that period was a very sad period for a lot of people. I lost friends, people lost family. There was something very sort of, again, not to be nostalgic about it, but there was something about sort of having a simpler sort of life and having this kind of community and people being forced to come together. And I really felt a sense of sort of Britain's back when we were allowed to go back outside. That's probably the most patriotic, I think, I felt when I'm wearing a mask, not just because of me, but because of my neighbor. There was that sort of thing, and it's a shame that it takes sometimes crisis to get us to that place. But as we end this conversation, just reflecting on us not having to wait for another crisis to kind of get to that place where we're checking on our neighbor again. Sort of speak to that really quickly.
I mean, you're obviously I've known you a little while. You kind of always seem to me to be happy, outgoing, and the sort of person who would quite naturally get their 5 a day, right? Whether it's a message or speaking to people in the community. And as you were speaking there, it kind of reminded me that one's sense of connection and belonging is not self-reinforcing. It will not, by default, deepen over time. Your sense of connection is like a muscle, and your sense of relationships with one another needs attention, and your relationships need cultivation. They need nurturing, and it can be, I think, on the other hand, a very negative cycle when you fall out of those relationships or the habit of connecting with people, saying hi to people on the street, feeling like you belong, that it can take you on a kind of downward spiral where then you do become susceptible to the more nihilistic manipulations and cultivations of people who would want to use your isolation and loneliness for their own ends, right? So, I mean, I think loneliness, to go back to the top of the conversation almost, right? Loneliness is a natural human emotion. We have to destigmatize that. And partly because of the pandemic, we have made progress on reducing the stigma around loneliness. But there are organizations that were part of that progress, whether it's my organization, the Cares Family, the Campaign to End Loneliness, the What Work Centre for Wellbeing, Opening Doors London, lots of organizations that were part of the movement towards creating a more connected society have sadly in the last 12 or 18 months disappeared. They no longer exist, including the organization that I founded. And so that reminds me that this is a constant process, whether it's as an individual, you need to constantly tend to your sense of connection, but also at that national level, which we're really talking about here, and even the international level, the architecture which can help make this country a more connected society and a less lonely society needs to be reinvested. So I think government has a job to do. They should renew the government loneliness strategy that was launched by Theresa May in 2018. They should reappoint a loneliness minister to cut across government to work in health and education and other departments all across government to make loneliness a priority, to make reducing loneliness a priority. It's on businesses to make people feel they can belong in their workplace, whether that's that people are working from home increasingly, or just this sense that work is now, you're in cubicles, you're always online, you're not necessarily deepening relationships maybe as people once were, but also individuals as well. And that comes back to the point of 5 a day, right? That muscle of feeling connected needs to be worked. Otherwise, I fear that we can become an increasingly disconnected society, an increasingly polarized society. That's bad for individuals. It's bad for the public health service. It's bad for our democracy ultimately as well.
Thank you for the work you're doing on this. I think we need more people like you just working and pulling us all in the right direction.
Well, I hope so. And thank you for the work that you're doing and helping other people feel connected too.
It's been lovely speaking to you.
You too, mate.